My cousin acted like royalty at our reunion. I reminded her where she came from. Our family has this big reunion every summer at my grandma's farm in Ohio. Everyone comes, all 50-something relatives, and we do the same thing every year. Potluck dinner, volleyball tournament, bonfire, and catching up with cousins we haven't seen since last summer. It's been going on for 40 years. This year, my cousin Diane showed up after being gone for 8 years. She'd married some investment banker named Paul and moved to Manhattan. First thing she did when she got out of her rented Mercedes was complain about the dirt road messing up her shoes. They were white designer heels at a farm. My aunt rushed over to hug her, and Diane did this air kiss thing to avoid actually touching her. She looked at the farmhouse and said it was quaint in that way where she meant dumpy. Asked if there was somewhere she could plug in her air purifier because she wasn't used to all the pollen anymore. Grandma said the guest room had outlets, and Diane said she'd actually booked a hotel 40 minutes away because she needed proper amenities. At dinner, everyone brought their signature dishes like always. Aunt Beth's potato salad, Uncle Ron's brisket, my mom's apple pie. Diane brought a single bottle of wine that she said cost $300, and we probably wouldn't appreciate it properly. But she wanted to contribute something. She wouldn't eat anything we made. Said she didn't know what was in it, and her nutritionist had her on a specific plan. She pulled out this pre-made salad from some organic place and ate that while explaining how processed foods were killing us. My 10-year-old nephew offered her a brownie he'd helped make, and she said sugar was poison, and his parents should know better. The kid looked crushed. During the volleyball game, Diane sat on the sidelines in her all-white outfit saying she didn't do activities that made her sweat anymore. She had people in the city for that. When cousin Amy mentioned she'd gotten promoted to manager at the bank, Diane laughed and said retail banking was adorable. When Uncle Joe talked about his construction company finally turning a profit, Diane said manual labor was so authentic. Every single accomplishment anyone mentioned, Diane had something condescending to say. My sister just had her third baby, and Diane asked if she knew about birth control. My brother got into law school, and Diane said state schools were a good starting point. Cousin Marie lost 30 pounds, and Diane said she should try her trainer who could actually get results. The worst was when she started giving everyone life advice. Told cousin Brian he was wasting his teaching degree and should go into consulting. Told Aunt Linda her divorce was because she'd let herself go. Actually walked up to my dad who's been farming for 35 years and said he could have been somebody if he'd had ambition. My dad just smiled, but I saw his jaw clench. Then Diane gathered everyone to announce that she and Paul were donating money to help improve the reunion. She'd already talked to event planners about making it more sophisticated. Real catering instead of potluck. A proper venue instead of the farm. Professional photography instead of Uncle Mike's camera. She said it was embarrassing that the family reunion looked like something from the 1980s. Grandma quietly said we liked it this way, but Diane talked over her saying tradition was just another word for being stuck in the past. She'd already put deposits down for next year at some country club. Paul would cover the costs because families shouldn't have to struggle. That's when I spoke up and said we should vote on it. Diane said voting was inefficient when she was the only one with experience planning proper events. She'd organized galas in Manhattan that we couldn't even imagine. She pulled out her phone to show us photos from these fancy parties she'd thrown, going on about the guest lists and the venues and the budgets. That gave me an idea. The next morning, I called my friend Nate, who works at a catering company in Columbus. Turns out they'd worked an event last month where Diane was a server. Not a guest. A server. She'd been picking up catering shifts because Paul's investment firm went under 6 months ago. They were broke and living with Paul's parents in Jersey, not Manhattan. The hotel she was staying at was actually my other cousin Tom's house, 10 minutes away. The Mercedes was a rental she couldn't afford. She'd been trying to get family money from Grandma, but didn't want anyone to know. When Diane showed up for day 2 of the reunion, still acting superior, I asked her about the catering company. Just mentioned that my friend Nate said they were hiring if anyone needed extra work. Diane went pale. Her coffee cup hit the picnic table harder than she meant it to. The liquid inside sloshed but didn't spill. I watched her fingers shake as she pulled them back into her lap. The smooth way she'd been talking since yesterday cracked around the edges. Her eyes darted between me and the other relatives scattered around the yard. She was trying to figure out what I knew and how much damage control she needed to do. She laughed, but it came out wrong. Her voice had that fake brightness people use when they're panicking but trying to hide it. She said something about catering companies always looking for event coordinators. Maybe my friend got confused. Maybe he saw someone who looked like her. The words tumbled out fast. But that sharp tone from yesterday was gone. The one where she made everything sound beneath her. Now she just sounded nervous. My mom glanced over from where she was setting up the volleyball net. Uncle Ron stopped mid-conversation with my dad. Several people were watching us now. Diane noticed. Her smile got tighter. I smiled back and said we should probably get the tournament started. People were waiting. I didn't push. Didn't ask follow-up questions. Just acted like we'd been having a normal conversation about nothing important. Diane stood up so fast her chair scraped against the concrete patio. She said she needed to use the bathroom. She walked toward the farmhouse with her shoulders rigid. Her white outfit from yesterday was replaced with jeans and a plain shirt, but she still moved like she was trying to look put together. I checked my watch when she went inside. Started counting. The rest of us hauled the net poles across the yard. My brother grabbed the ball from the garage. Aunt Beth marked boundary lines with flour like she does every year. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Diane still hadn't come back out. The bathroom was a 2-minute trip from the patio. I saw Paul glance at the farmhouse door twice. He looked worried but didn't go check on her. My sister caught my eye from across the yard. She mouthed something I couldn't quite read, but I got the meaning. What was that about? What did you say to Diane? I shook my head, gave her a small gesture that meant not now. She frowned but nodded. I wasn't ready to explain. Wasn't even sure what I wanted to do with what I'd learned. Part of me felt satisfied catching Diane in her lies, but another part kept thinking about her working as a server at the same kind of events she used to attend as a guest. That had to hurt. Diane finally emerged from the farmhouse. Her makeup looked fresh. She'd fixed her hair. The mask was back in place, but not quite as solid as before. She walked over to the sidelines and sat in the same lawn chair from yesterday, but she didn't say anything. Yesterday, she'd made comments about sweating being beneath her, about having people in the city for physical activities. Today, she just sat there quiet. She watched the game with this blank expression. When Uncle Joe made a joke about his bad serve, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I pulled out my phone during a break between games, texted my friend, asked if he remembered any other details about Diane working at the catering company. What dates, what events, anything else she might have said. He responded within 5 minutes, sent me the company name, said it was mid-March through early April. 4 or 5 events total. He remembered her because she seemed stressed. She'd mentioned money troubles to another server during a break. Said something about storage fees and credit cards. My stomach did this uncomfortable flip reading his texts. I stood there staring at my phone trying to sort out how I felt. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. She'd been so cruel yesterday. Told my nephew sugar was poison. Told my dad he could have been somebody. Dismissed everyone's accomplishments like they were nothing. She deserved to be called out. But I kept picturing her serving food at fancy parties, wearing a uniform, taking orders from the same kind of people she used to be. Paul's investment firm going under wasn't her fault. The economy crashes, companies fail, and the shame of falling that far that fast had to be crushing her. Maybe that's why she came here acting superior. Maybe putting everyone else down was the only way she could feel like she hadn't lost everything. I felt someone beside me and looked up. My grandmother was standing there with that expression she gets. The one that says she knows something is wrong and she's not going to let it go. She asked if everything was okay. Her voice was gentle but firm. I realized she must have noticed the weird tension between Diane and me. The way Diane went pale. The way she disappeared for 20 minutes. My grandmother doesn't miss much. I told her I needed to talk to her later. Somewhere private. She didn't ask questions. Just squeezed my hand and said we'd figure it out together. Whatever it was. That's what family does. Her words made me feel better and worse at the same time. Better because I wasn't alone in this. Worse because I was planning to expose Diane, and part of me wondered if that made me cruel too. The lunch bell rang and everyone headed toward the picnic tables. Aunt Beth had set out the food buffet style like always. Potato salad and brisket and 3 different casseroles. My mom's apple pie sat on the dessert table. Diane pulled her organic salad out of a cooler. The same kind she'd eaten yesterday while lecturing us about processed foods. But today she didn't say anything. Just picked at the lettuce with her plastic fork. She kept her eyes on her plate. I sat diagonal from her with a full plate of actual reunion food. Paul sat beside her looking uncomfortable. He kept glancing at her, then at me, then back at his own plate. I wondered how much he knew. Did he support her plan to come here and perform success? Or did he try to talk her out of it? Was he embarrassed by her behavior yesterday? Or was he too desperate for money to care how she got it? I cleared my plate and headed toward the kitchen. Aunt Beth caught me by the elbow near the back door. She pulled me aside and her voice dropped low. Said Diane seemed different this morning. Less sharp. Less critical. She wanted to know if I'd said something to her. I felt my stomach twist because I knew exactly why Diane was different. I shrugged and told Aunt Beth that maybe Diane was just tired from traveling. Long drive and all that. Aunt Beth nodded but didn't look convinced. She patted my arm and said she hoped Diane was feeling okay. I watched her walk back to the dessert table and felt guilty for lying, but I wasn't ready to explain what I knew. Not yet. The afternoon stretched out with people playing cards on the porch and kids running around with water balloons. I found myself watching Diane without meaning to. Really watching her this time instead of just reacting to what she said. She sat in one of the old lawn chairs with her designer purse on her lap. The purse looked expensive, but the metal clasp was broken. She kept adjusting it so the broken part faced away from everyone. Her nails were painted, but the polish was chipped and grown out at least 2 weeks. When she thought no one was looking, her face changed completely. The superior expression melted away, and what was left looked exhausted. Scared even. She kept checking her phone and biting her bottom lip. Paul sat next to her and she leaned into him slightly. Not the way someone shows off their husband, but the way someone holds on to the only solid thing they have left. Uncle Joe came out of the house carrying a cooler of drinks. He set it down near the volleyball net and announced he was heading back to work tomorrow. Said his construction company had 3 new projects starting next week. Then he looked around at everyone and mentioned they were hiring if anyone knew people looking for work. Good pay and benefits. Diane's whole body went rigid. Her hands clenched around her purse and her face went pale again just like it had this morning. Paul jumped in fast and asked about the bonfire plans for tonight. What time were we starting? Did we need more firewood? His voice was too loud and too cheerful. Uncle Joe looked confused by the sudden subject change but went along with it. Started talking about the woodpile behind the barn. I sat down on the porch steps and let the conversation wash over me. My brain was putting pieces together I hadn't wanted to see before. Diane's cruelty yesterday wasn't just snobbery. It was defense. She'd attacked everyone else's normal lives because she couldn't face admitting her own life had fallen apart. Telling my nephew sugar was poison. Telling my dad he lacked ambition. Dismissing everyone's jobs and accomplishments. It was all about making herself feel less like a failure by making everyone else feel small. The thought made my anger shift into something more complicated, something that felt less like justice and more like watching someone drown while pretending they could swim. My brother found me before dinner. He sat down next to me on the porch steps and didn't say anything for a minute. Then he asked point blank if I knew something about Diane's situation. Said he'd noticed the weird tension between us. The way she went pale when I mentioned the catering company. The way she'd been avoiding me all afternoon. I looked at him and decided I was tired of keeping it to myself. Told him I'd discovered she was lying about her life in Manhattan. That Paul's firm went under. That they were broke and living with his parents in New Jersey. That she'd been working as a catering server at the fancy parties she claimed to attend as a guest. My brother's eyes went wide. He asked if I was planning to expose her in front of everyone. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. Part of me wanted her to face consequences for how she'd treated our family. She'd hurt people. Made my nephew feel bad about his brownies. Insulted our dad's whole life. But another part of me recognized that humiliating her might be cruel given what she was actually going through. My brother nodded slowly. Said it was a tough call. That Diane had been awful. But exposing her would be brutal. He squeezed my shoulder and said he'd back whatever I decided to do. People started gathering in the kitchen to help with dinner prep. I went around the side of the house to grab some folding chairs from the shed. That's when I heard Diane's voice. She was on her phone around the corner. I froze because I didn't want to interrupt, but then I heard what she was saying. Her voice was shaking. She was talking to someone about trying again tomorrow to approach Grandma about a loan. Said the timing hadn't been right yet. That she needed to find the perfect moment, that she couldn't mess this up because they were running out of options. She sounded close to tears. Said they were 2 months behind on storage fees for their furniture. That the car rental was maxing out their last credit card. That Paul's parents were being patient, but they couldn't stay there forever. The desperation in her voice was so raw it made my chest hurt. I felt like I was intruding on something private just by accidentally hearing it. This wasn't the superior cousin from yesterday. This was someone drowning and trying to keep her head above water by sheer force of will. I backed away before she noticed me. Walked to the shed and grabbed the chairs, but my mind was spinning. She hadn't come here to show off. She hadn't come to take over the reunion out of snobbery. She came because she was drowning financially, and too proud to ask for help without first establishing that she didn't really need it. The whole performance was about setting up a situation where she could get money from Grandma while saving face. Where she could pretend she was doing fine and just being generous when really she was desperate and scared. Dinner was set up buffet style on the long tables. Everyone filled their plates and found seats. Diane sat at the far end with Paul beside her. She barely touched her food. Just pushed lettuce around her plate with a fork. When people talked, she didn't join in, didn't make any comments, didn't offer any advice, just sat there looking small and tired. Grandma noticed and asked if she was feeling well. Diane said she might be coming down with something. Paul suggested they might need to leave early tomorrow. My grandmother's face showed concern, and she told Diane to get some rest. That family was more important than staying for the whole weekend if she wasn't feeling good. I looked away from Diane and scanned the dinner table. Paul sat across from her, barely touching his plate. His fork moved food around without actually eating anything. When Diane laughed too loudly at something my mom said, Paul's jaw tightened and he glanced at her with this look that stopped me cold. It wasn't anger or frustration. It was worry. Pure, deep worry that had nothing to do with himself. He was watching her like you'd watch someone walking on ice that might crack at any second. His eyes followed her every movement, every forced smile, every too bright comment. He clearly loved her despite everything. Despite the lies and the performance and the mess they were in. He was sitting there watching her come apart under the weight of keeping up appearances, and it was killing him. That look told me more than any conversation could. Whatever else was happening, Paul wasn't some villain who'd dragged Diane into this. They were drowning together, and he was trying to keep her head above water even as his own went under. Dinner wrapped up around 8. People started clearing plates and packing up leftovers. Diane excused herself early, saying she needed to lie down. Paul followed her out without a word to anyone else. I waited until most of the family had drifted to the living room or outside before finding my grandmother. She was in the kitchen wiping down counters with the same yellow cloth she'd used for 30 years. I touched her arm and asked if we could talk privately. She looked at me with those sharp eyes that missed nothing and nodded. We walked down the hallway to her bedroom, a small space with floral wallpaper and photos covering every surface. She sat on the edge of her bed and patted the spot next to her. I sat down and the words came out in a rush. I told her about calling Nate, about the catering company, about Diane working as a server at the parties she claimed to attend, about Paul's firm going under 6 months ago, about them living with his parents in Jersey, not Manhattan, about the rental car and the fake hotel, and the whole desperate plan to get money while pretending they didn't need it. My grandmother listened without interrupting. Her face grew sadder with each detail, but not surprised. Not shocked. Just sad in that deep way that comes from understanding rather than learning something new. When I finished, she let out a long breath. She said she'd suspected something was wrong when Diane called last month asking about the reunion dates. Diane hadn't come to a reunion in 8 years. Always too busy, always had something more important happening in the city. Then suddenly she wanted to know the exact weekend, wanted to make sure she could attend, asked specific questions about who else would be there. My grandmother had hoped Diane was finally ready to reconnect with family after all those years away, that maybe marriage and time had softened her, made her realize what mattered. But she'd also sensed something off in Diane's voice. a strain that didn't match the casual tone she was trying for, an edge of desperation underneath the pleasant words. She'd pushed those feelings aside, told herself she was reading too much into it. Now she knew her instincts had been right. I asked what she thought I should do with this information. The question hung in the air between us. My grandmother was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands folded in her lap, at the worn gold band on her finger that my grandfather had put there 53 years ago. When she spoke, her voice was careful. She said Diane's lies had hurt people yesterday. My nephew with his brownies, my dad with that comment about ambition, my sister, my brother, everyone who'd shared their accomplishments only to have Diane tear them down. Those wounds were real and they mattered. But exposing Diane publicly would hurt her even more, would humiliate her in front of everyone, would strip away the last shred of dignity she was clinging to. And my grandmother wasn't sure more hurt was what this family needed right now. Not when there was already so much pain underneath the surface. She went on, her words coming slower now. She said if Diane had just asked for help directly, she would have given it. No questions, no conditions, no judgment. That's what family does. But the fact that Diane felt she couldn't do that she had to perform success and manipulate her way to a loan, that disappointed her more than the money ever could. It meant Diane didn't trust her own family with the truth. Didn't believe we'd accept her without the fancy clothes and the Manhattan stories and the pretend wealth. Pride had made Diane lie. Pride had made her attack everyone else to protect her own image. And pride, my grandmother said quietly, can destroy a person faster than any financial crisis. She'd seen it happen before in our family, in other families. People who'd rather suffer alone than admit they needed help. People who built walls so high they couldn't get out from behind them even when they wanted to. We sat there for another few minutes working through what came next. My grandmother decided she'd create an opportunity tomorrow to talk with Diane privately. She'd offer help without making it a public thing, without forcing Diane through the shame of everyone knowing. But she wanted me there too. I was the one who'd uncovered the truth, and Diane needed to understand that her behavior had consequences, that people had noticed, that the performance hadn't worked the way she'd hoped. It wouldn't be cruel, my grandmother promised, but it would be honest. Real help required real honesty, not more pretending. I agreed, and we left her bedroom to rejoin the family. The bonfire was already going when we came outside. Someone had dragged logs into a circle around the fire pit. Kids ran around with sparklers while adults settled into chairs with beers and soda. The sky had gone purple, stars starting to show through. Diane and Paul sat on a log at the edge of the circle, away from the main group. They weren't talking to each other, just sitting side by side staring at the flames. Diane's shoulders were hunched forward like she was trying to make herself smaller. Paul's hand rested on her back, a gesture of comfort that she didn't seem to notice. I watched other family members glance their way and then look away quickly. Aunt Linda whispered something to Uncle Ron, her head tilted toward Diane. Uncle Ron shook his head slightly and whispered back. The strange energy from this morning had spread. People could feel something was off even if they didn't know what. My nephew appeared next to me holding a plate. He had a s'more on it, marshmallow melted and chocolate oozing out the sides. He looked up at me and asked if I thought Diane would want it. His voice was small, still carrying the hurt from yesterday when she'd called his brownies poison. I told him I thought she would, that it was really nice of him to think of her. He walked across the circle toward Diane, his steps hesitant. When he reached her, he held out the plate. His words were too quiet for me to hear over the fire's crackle, but I saw Diane's face change. Her eyes filled with tears that caught the firelight. She took the s'more with shaking hands and thanked him. The kid sat down next to her on the log, and she bit into the s'more, chocolate smearing on her lip. A tear ran down her cheek, but she smiled at my nephew and said something that made him grin. Watching her sit there struggling to hold herself together while eating that s'more, I felt the last of my anger drain away. It didn't disappear into nothing. It transformed into something sadder and more complicated. Recognition, maybe. Understanding that we're all just people trying to make it through whatever situation we're stuck in. Sometimes we handle it well, and sometimes we handle it badly. Sometimes we hurt others because we're hurting ourselves. Diane had been cruel yesterday, but she'd also been terrified and ashamed and desperate. That didn't excuse what she'd done, but it explained it in a way that made me see her as human, rather than villain. My nephew leaned against her shoulder, and she wrapped an arm around him, and in that moment she looked less like the superior cousin from yesterday, and more like someone who'd been drowning, and just found something to hold on to. Paul stood up from the log and walked toward me. He asked quietly if we could talk away from everyone else. We moved past the circle of firelight into the darker yard where the grass was still damp from afternoon rain. He stopped near the fence and turned to face me. He said he knew I'd figured out their situation based on how Diane had reacted this morning. There was no point pretending otherwise. His voice was tired, stripped of any defensiveness or pride. I told him I understood. Paul nodded and looked back toward the bonfire where Diane sat with my nephew. He said losing the investment firm destroyed him in ways he didn't expect. The money vanishing hurt, but watching Diane try to hold everything together while he fell apart was worse. She'd taken 3 part-time jobs, including the catering work, while he spent weeks barely getting out of bed. When she suggested coming to the reunion, he thought it was a terrible idea. She insisted, though, saying she couldn't let her family see them as failures. Paul said she spent 2 months planning this performance, rehearsing stories about their Manhattan life, buying clothes she couldn't afford on credit cards they shouldn't have used. He tried talking her out of it multiple times, but she was convinced this was the only way. Her plan was to get money from Grandma, but only after first proving they were still successful, and just being generous with the country club donation. The twisted logic came from pure fear and shame. She couldn't ask for help as someone who'd failed, so she needed to ask as someone who was thriving. Paul rubbed his face with both hands and said he knew the lies would collapse eventually, but Diane was so desperate he couldn't find the strength to stop her. I told him about the plan for Grandma to talk with Diane tomorrow morning. His whole body seemed to relax slightly. He said Diane needed help with money, but more than that, she needed to stop running from the truth. She needed to let her family see her as she actually was, instead of this fake version she'd created. Paul thanked me for not exposing her publicly at dinner tonight, and said he hoped tomorrow would be the start of something more honest for both of them. We walked back to the bonfire together. I sat down next to my sister on one of the log benches. She leaned close and whispered that she felt bad about being angry at Diane yesterday. Something clearly wasn't right with her. Even though Diane had been cruel with her comments about birth control and the third baby, my sister said it felt like there was a bigger story happening underneath the surface. I squeezed her hand and told her we'd know more tomorrow. Sometimes people lash out when they're drowning, and it has nothing to do with the people they're hurting. My sister nodded slowly and said she hoped Diane got whatever help she needed. Nobody should have to pretend to be okay when they're actually falling apart inside. The bonfire started winding down around 10. Families gathered their kids and empty dishes. People said goodnight and headed toward their cars or the guest rooms inside the farmhouse. I watched Diane and Paul stand up from their log and brush grass off their clothes. They walked together toward the dirt road that led to Tom's house where they were actually staying. Their shoulders touched as they moved through the darkness beyond the fire's light. Something about that small contact spoke to shared burden and support, despite everything that had happened. They were in this mess together, and whatever came next, they'd face it the same way. I helped clean up the bonfire area with my dad and a few uncles. We dumped water on the coals and made sure everything was safe before heading inside. The farmhouse was quiet with most people already in bed. I climbed the stairs to Grandma's guest room and changed into my pajamas. The bed was comfortable, but sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the darkness thinking about pride and shame and how fast everything can change. 6 months ago, Diane probably did attend those fancy galas she'd shown us photos of. Now she was serving food at similar events while pretending her life hadn't changed at all. The distance between those two realities was so small in time, but so massive in every other way. Financial security could disappear in months or even weeks. The things we use to define ourselves could vanish and leave us scrambling to figure out who we are without them. Morning arrived with rain pattering against the farmhouse roof. The sound was gentle and steady. I got dressed and went downstairs where Grandma was already making coffee and setting out breakfast supplies. The usual Sunday morning meal felt different somehow. Quieter and more careful. Family members drifted in slowly and filled plates with eggs and bacon and toast. Diane and Paul showed up almost 30 minutes late. Both of them looked like they'd barely slept. Diane's face was pale without much makeup, and her eyes had dark circles underneath. The designer clothes from yesterday were gone. She wore simple jeans and a plain sweater that looked like something she'd owned for years. Paul stayed close to her side as they got coffee and found seats at the far end of the table. Breakfast conversation was subdued. People talked about their drives home and thanked Grandma for hosting another great reunion. Nobody mentioned the country club plan or Diane's behavior from the first day. After everyone finished eating, Grandma stood up and asked Diane to help her with something in the study. Diane's face went carefully blank, but I saw her hands shake slightly as she set down her coffee mug. I followed them as we'd planned. When Diane saw me enter the study behind Grandma and close the door, her expression showed she knew something was coming. She looked trapped and scared. Grandma sat down in her armchair and gestured for Diane to take the chair across from her. I stood near the door. Grandma started talking in her gentle way, saying she'd always loved Diane and nothing would ever change that. But she knew Diane hadn't been honest about her current situation. Diane immediately opened her mouth to deny it. Her voice came out shaky and the words seemed to catch in her throat before dying completely. I looked at Grandma and said I found out some things about her situation. My friend works at a catering company in Columbus and recognized Diane from an event last month. She wasn't a guest at those fancy parties she showed us photos of. She was serving food, working shifts because she and Paul needed money. Diane's whole body went stiff like someone had just slapped her across the face. The color drained from her cheeks and she gripped the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. Her mouth opened but nothing came out at first. Just this small gasping sound like she couldn't get enough air. Then she covered her face with both hands, and her shoulders started shaking. The crying started quiet but got louder fast. These deep sobs that seemed to come from somewhere way down inside her chest. Her carefully styled hair fell forward as she bent over in the chair. The designer sweater she wore looked suddenly wrong on her like a costume that didn't fit anymore. Grandma looked at me with sad eyes but didn't say anything. She just waited while Diane cried into her hands. I stood there feeling my stomach twist because part of me had wanted to see her caught, and another part felt awful watching her fall apart like this. The study was quiet except for the sound of her crying and the rain still pattering on the windows. After what felt like forever, Diane finally lowered her hands. Her face was red and blotchy with mascara smeared under her eyes. She looked at Grandma first, then at me. Her voice came out shaky and broken when she started talking. She said Paul's firm collapsed 6 months ago. Everything just fell apart so fast. One day they had their Manhattan apartment and their life, and the next day it was all gone. The bankruptcy happened within weeks. They lost everything except what they could fit in 2 suitcases when they moved in with Paul's parents in Jersey. She'd been picking up catering work whenever she could get shifts, standing in the same rooms where she used to attend parties as a guest, but now she was the help, serving food to people who might have known her before. The debt kept growing no matter what they did. Credit cards maxed out, student loans in default, storage fees for their furniture because they couldn't afford to keep it or sell it for what they owed. She said the worst part wasn't losing the money. It was losing who she thought she was. For 8 years, she'd defined herself by Paul's success and their lifestyle and their address. Without those things, she didn't know who she was anymore. Coming back to the reunion and seeing everyone with their normal, stable lives made her feel like the biggest failure in the world. My sister with her 3 kids and her happy marriage. My brother getting into law school. Cousin Amy promoted at the bank. Uncle Joe's construction company turning a profit. Everyone was doing fine with their regular lives while she'd crashed and burned trying to be special. She said she couldn't help attacking them yesterday. If she could make their accomplishments seem small and unimpressive, then maybe her own situation wouldn't feel so terrible by comparison. If she could convince herself that their lives were boring and limited, then losing her supposedly amazing life wouldn't hurt so much. But she knew even while she was saying those awful things that it wasn't true and it wasn't fair. She just couldn't seem to stop herself. Grandma got up from her chair and moved to sit in the chair right next to Diane's. She took Diane's hand and held it between both of hers. Her voice was gentle when she spoke, but firm too. She said money comes and goes and always has throughout history. The farm nearly went under in the 80s. My parents struggled when my dad first took over. Uncle Joe's construction business almost failed twice before it finally worked. Financial trouble happens to everyone at some point. But family doesn't disappear when the money does. Family stays constant through all of it. She asked Diane why she didn't just tell the truth when she first got here. Why come back after 8 years and put on this whole performance instead of just asking for help? Why plan to manipulate her way to a loan by first convincing everyone she didn't need it? Diane's face crumpled again. She said she was too ashamed. She'd spent 8 years telling everyone about Manhattan and Paul's big success and their fancy life. She'd skipped reunions because she was too busy with her important city life. She'd sent Christmas cards with photos of them at galas and restaurants and vacation spots. Everyone thought she'd made it. She couldn't bear to come back and admit it all disappeared. That she was broke and desperate and living with Paul's parents like some kid who couldn't make it on her own. She thought if she could just maintain the image while getting financial help from Grandma, she could rebuild without anyone knowing how far they'd fallen. She could get back on her feet, and then eventually the lie would become true again. I spoke up then because I needed to say this even though it was hard. I told Diane that her behavior yesterday hurt people. Real people who love her. My nephew who made her a brownie and she told him sugar was poison. He cried about it later. My sister who just had a baby and Diane asked if she knew about birth control. My brother excited about law school and she dismissed it. Cousin Marie proud of losing weight and Diane said it wasn't enough. She tore down everyone's accomplishments because she was in pain, but that doesn't make it okay. Getting help from family doesn't require destroying other people first. Her pain doesn't give her permission to cause pain to people who only wanted to welcome her back. Diane nodded and more tears ran down her face. She said she knows. She hated herself even while the words were coming out of her mouth, but she couldn't seem to stop. Every mean comment felt like a reflex she couldn't control. She apologized to me directly for all the condescending things she said. Then she asked how she could possibly face everyone else after acting like that. How could she walk out there and admit she'd been lying and ask for forgiveness when she'd been so cruel? Grandma squeezed Diane's hand and said she needs to apologize to the family honestly. That means admitting the truth about everything. Her situation, her lies, her reasons for coming back. It will be uncomfortable and probably the hardest thing she's done in a long time. But it's the only way to start rebuilding trust. The only way to accept the genuine help her family wants to offer. Grandma said people can forgive a lot if you're honest with them, but they can't forgive being manipulated and lied to while you hurt them. We sat there for a few more minutes while Diane pulled herself together. She wiped her face with tissues from the box on Grandma's desk, fixed her hair as much as she could, took some deep breaths. Then we walked back toward the main room where everyone was gathered for the traditional Sunday goodbye brunch. I could hear voices and the sound of dishes and normal family conversation. Diane stopped in the doorway looking absolutely scared. Her hand grabbed the doorframe like she needed something to hold on to. Paul must have been watching for her because he immediately got up from where he was sitting and came over. He didn't say anything, just stood next to her with his hand on her back. That simple gesture of support seemed to help because she took another breath and walked into the room. People noticed us right away and conversations got quieter. Diane stood there in the middle of everyone looking like she might pass out. Her voice shook when she asked for everyone's attention. The room went completely silent. She apologized for her behavior yesterday, said she wasn't honest about her life and she needed to tell them the truth. Then she explained about Paul's firm collapsing and their bankruptcy and living with his parents. She admitted the catering work and the debt and how ashamed she felt. She said the shame made her lash out at everyone instead of being real and asking for help the way she should have. Her voice broke several times while she talked, but she kept going until she'd said it all. Nobody moved. The room felt frozen, like someone had pressed pause on everything. My nephew was the one who broke it. He walked across the floor to where Diane stood shaking and wrapped his arms around her waist. He told her it was okay, and he still wanted her to have his brownies if she wanted them. His voice was small but steady. Diane put her hand on his head and started crying again. Different this time. Softer. I saw my sister wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. Uncle Ron cleared his throat and looked down at his plate. The tension in the room shifted from anger to something gentler, like everyone was exhaling at the same time. Aunt Beth stood up from her chair and walked over to Diane. She put her hand on Diane's shoulder and said, "We've all had hard times at some point. That's what family is for, helping each other through the rough patches." She squeezed Diane's shoulder before going back to her seat. Uncle Joe spoke up from the other side of the room. He mentioned that his construction company was hiring if Paul had any interest in project management work. He said the pay wasn't Manhattan money, but it was steady, and they could use someone who understood numbers. Paul looked up surprised and said he'd appreciate talking about it. His voice was rough, like he was holding back emotion. My brother stood up next. He said his law school had a program that helped people work through bankruptcy and debt stuff. He could connect them with resources and people who knew how to handle it the right way. He pulled out his phone to make a note of their contact information. Cousin Amy said she worked at the bank and could review their financial situation from a banking side. She could help them see what options existed for consolidating debt or setting up payment plans. She wasn't pushy about it, just offered it like a normal thing. I watched Diane's face as people kept offering help. She looked shocked that anyone would step forward after how she'd acted. Not everyone was warm about it, though. Aunt Linda stayed quiet in her corner. Cousin Brian didn't say anything either. I could see hurt still sitting on their faces from yesterday's comments. The room wasn't united in forgiveness, but enough people stepped up with real practical help that Diane started crying harder. This time it looked like relief instead of shame. Her shoulders shook and Paul moved closer to put his arm around her. She leaned into him and let herself cry properly while people gave her space to fall apart. Grandma stood up slowly from her chair at the head of the table. Everyone got quiet again, waiting to hear what she'd say. She looked at Diane for a long moment before speaking. She announced she'd provide a loan to help them get back on their feet, but it would have clear terms and expectations about paying it back when they were able. She emphasized this was family helping family, not charity. Diane needed to accept it with dignity instead of shame. Grandma's voice was firm but kind. She said the amount would be enough to clear their immediate debts and get them into their own place. They'd work out a payment plan that made sense for their situation. Diane nodded and whispered, "Thank you," so quietly I almost couldn't hear it. Diane wiped her face with her hands and took a shaky breath. She thanked everyone, looking around the room at each person. Then she started apologizing specifically to people. She looked at my nephew and said she was sorry for being mean about his brownies. She told my sister she was sorry for the awful comment about birth control. She apologized to my brother for dismissing his law school achievement. She turned to Cousin Marie and said she was sorry for criticizing her weight loss when she should have celebrated it. She went through person after person, naming what she'd said and taking it back. Some people nodded and accepted it easily. Others stayed quiet and didn't respond. I could tell this would take time to actually heal. Words couldn't erase the hurt that fast. Paul cleared his throat and spoke up. He thanked the family for their response. He said he should have stopped Diane from coming here with false stories about their life. They were both learning how to handle failure with more grace. This family's response was teaching them what real support looked like instead of the fake network they'd built in the city. He admitted they'd been so focused on appearing successful that they'd forgotten how to ask for actual help. His voice was steady and honest. I respected him more in that moment than I had the whole weekend. The goodbye brunch started up again after that. People went back to eating and talking, but the conversations were different now. There was a new awareness in the room about Diane and Paul's situation. My dad moved his chair closer to where Paul was sitting. He started talking about the value of starting over and rebuilding slowly. He told Paul about nearly losing the farm in the 80s when crop prices crashed. How he'd had to take a second job in town and swallow his pride to accept help from family. How it took years to get back to stable ground, but doing it the right way made it last. Paul listened carefully and asked questions about how my dad had handled the stress and uncertainty. They talked for a long time while the brunch wound down. Before people started leaving, Diane came over to where I was standing by the kitchen. She asked if we could talk privately for a minute. We walked out to the porch where it was quieter. She thanked me for finding out the truth, but said I'd handled it with more kindness than she deserved. Being exposed was scary, but also a relief. Like she could finally stop acting and just be honest about struggling. Her makeup was smudged from crying and she looked exhausted, but more real than she had all weekend. She said keeping up the lies was harder than actually being broke. I told her everyone struggles sometimes. Pretending otherwise just makes it harder to get real help when you need it. She nodded and said she was learning that lesson, but the hard way. She was grateful her family didn't give up on her even after how she'd acted. I said family means showing up even when it's uncomfortable. She smiled a little at that and said she'd forgotten that while living in the city. We stood there quiet for a minute watching people load their cars. Then she went back inside to help clean up. The afternoon wound down with people loading coolers and folding chairs into their cars. Kids ran around saying goodbye to cousins they wouldn't see until next summer. Grandma found me by the porch steps and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. She said she was proud of how I'd handled everything with Diane. I could have embarrassed her in front of everyone, made a big show of exposing her lies, but instead I'd given her space to come clean on her own terms. That took more strength than public humiliation would have. I told Grandma I wasn't sure I'd done the right thing, that maybe Diane needed to face harder consequences for how she'd treated people. Grandma shook her head and said consequences were already happening in Diane's life, that she didn't need us piling on more shame when she was clearly drowning in it already. We watched Diane help pack up the leftovers, moving quietly between family members who were still deciding how they felt about her apology. Over the next few weeks, I texted Diane every few days. Nothing deep, just checking in to see how she was doing. She responded slowly at first, like she wasn't sure if I actually wanted to talk or was just being polite. Then she started opening up more. She'd found a therapist who specialized in financial anxiety and shame, and the sessions were helping her understand why she'd built such an elaborate lie instead of just asking for help. Paul had taken the job with Uncle Joe's construction company doing project management. The pay wasn't great yet, but it was steady work, and Uncle Joe was teaching him the business side of running a company. Diane said it was weird seeing Paul come home tired and dirty from job sites, so different from his banking days, but he seemed happier than he'd been in months. They were staying with Paul's parents still, but actively looking for their own place within their new budget. 2 months after the reunion, my phone buzzed with a photo from Diane. It showed her and Paul standing in a small living room with boxes stacked against bare walls. The text said they'd finally signed a lease on their own apartment. It wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom in a building that had seen better days, but it was honestly theirs without pretending or performing for anyone. She said she was learning to find value in things that were real instead of things that looked impressive. The apartment had old carpet and a kitchen smaller than their closet used to be, but when they'd gotten the keys that morning, she'd felt more relief than she had moving into any of their fancy places before. She was working 2 part-time jobs now, one at a bookstore and one doing administrative work for a nonprofit. Neither job was glamorous, but both paid on time, and she was building a life based on what they could actually afford, instead of what they wanted people to think they could afford. Grandma called a family meeting about next year's reunion plans. Diane had offered to cover costs for the country club venue she'd put deposits on, using money Grandma had loaned them, but Grandma shut that down immediately. We were keeping the reunion exactly where it had always been, at the farm with everyone bringing potluck dishes like we'd done for 40 years. The tradition worked because it was ours, not because it was fancy or impressive. A few days later, Diane called me directly instead of texting. She said she and Paul were already planning to come to next year's reunion, and this time she was actually looking forward to it. She could show up as herself without the designer clothes or the fake stories about Manhattan galas. She could bring a real dish instead of expensive wine, play volleyball instead of sitting on the sidelines, and let her nephew offer her brownies without acting like sugar was poison. She laughed a little when she said that last part, admitting how ridiculous she'd been. I told her everyone has moments they're not proud of, and what matters is showing up better the next time. She agreed and said that's exactly what she planned to do.